Hello and welcome to Western Sydney Community Forum's interactive live stream forum. So my name is Billie Sankovic and I'm your host for today's session. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands that we are meeting on here today for our session. And I'm personally standing on Tharawal land in the Macarthur region of southwest Sydney, and I pay my respects to elders on this land and beyond, both past, present, and of course future. And I also acknowledge with respect Aboriginal friends and colleagues who are joining us here today for our session. So thank you for joining us. I mean, we know it's been an extraordinary time of uncertainty, and it certainly continues to be a time of uncertainty, and Western Sydney has been impacted disproportionately. And we know that just in recent days we've had some terrible news of impacts on local families and individuals due to COVID-19. And we acknowledge the important role of the human services industry in being at the forefront of supporting communities who experience vulnerability and crisis, not just in these uncertain times, but in other times as well. So the interactive live stream forums are really an opportunity to bring together services and partners across Western Sydney in this time of uncertainty to provide information on priorities and also to provide a platform for sharing of tools and resources and of ideas. And today is very much about ideas. Today we'll be focusing on discussing and visioning the future of Western Sydney post COVID-19. And today is an opportunity for Western Sydney Community Forum as the Social Development Council for Western Sydney and as regional thought leaders to consider some of those big questions about what a healthier, what a fairer, more accessible and equitable future might look like for Western Sydney. So to kick off, I'd like to introduce our panellist and my fellow colleagues at Western Sydney Community Forum, starting with Dr. Andy Marks. Andy is the Assistant Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney University and also the Chair of Western Sydney Community Forum. Hi, Andy.
G'day, Billie. How are you?
I'm well. It's a big questions we got to ask today, so an interesting conversation. I'd also like to introduce Natalie Chiappazzo. Natalie is the manager at Blacktown Youth Services Association, and Natalie is also the secretary at Western Sydney Community Forum. Hello, Natalie, and welcome.
Hi, Billie. How are you?
Good. Thanks for being here. And I'd like to introduce Ben Jackson, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Great Community Transport in Western Sydney and also the Treasurer. Keeps the books in order, don't you, Ben, at Western Sydney Community Forum?
Thanks for having me, Billie. Hello, everyone.
Well, thanks for being here today. And as I said, we've got some big questions to ponder today, looking ahead and thinking about what the future might look like and a fairer future. But before we kick off, I've got to do some housekeeping. So I'd just like to remind everyone that this is an interactive session and there is opportunity to contribute to the conversation. In fact, we encourage you to do so and by making comments or asking questions. So there's two ways in which you can do that. Firstly, you may choose to raise your hand on your device. You'll join a queue and we'll invite you to share your comment or question through the voice facility. But if you'd prefer, you might wish to click on the Q&A button on your device and you can type your comment or your question. And in that case, I'll read that out on your behalf. And as I said, we encourage you to participate in the conversation. If you are joining us on the live stream today, you can also post your comments on the live stream and they will be brought into the session and we'll be able to respond to those. So hopefully you've been familiarising yourself with the platform while I've been outlining it. So Andy, Ben, Natalie, as I said, important questions for us to be asking ourselves. I mean, to set the scene, we know that thought leaders across all industries, not just the human services industry, and across all disciplines, both locally and globally, are considering the post-COVID-19 future. And what we know is that history tells us that some level of change is inevitable following a significant crisis, and in this case, COVID. And historically, we've seen change across many areas. We've seen change in macroeconomic frameworks that really set the scene for how we operate as a society and as an economy. We've also seen change in the role of government and public policy. And we've also seen change grassroots in terms of community worldviews and expectations. Now, these are big picture considerations, but let's be clear, they shape how we operate. They also shape how we understand and live our lives. So we mustn't shy away from these questions. Now, at a national level, you know, we've heard talks about snapbacks and return to normal, but we've also seen shifts in the public dialogue calling for sort of a different, fairer approach to issues surrounding equity or inequity. So this shift is incredibly important for Western Sydney, where there's sort of overwhelming, as we all know, evidence of inequity across a number of fronts, be it education or employment or housing or transport or access to service. So within that context, I'd really like to kick off, perhaps with you, Andy, and then Natalie and Ben, if you can also share your thoughts. What impacts are you all seeing on community and hearing, and how might this be playing out differently in Western Sydney relative to Sydney overall?
Thanks, Billie. A really good and expansive question. One of the most profound impacts I felt, I think, and this ties into the economic response, was the fact that it took a pandemic for governments to treat people on New Start decently. I think that the natural impulse from government will be to make this a recovery all based on an economic narrative. And you've just highlighted some of those phrases around snapback. And I think we've heard the term recession more times than we care to mention of late. The challenge will be, firstly, what do we take out of this pandemic in terms of what behavioural changes do we hang on to? And how do we ensure that the dominant behaviours that emerge aren't solely concerned with economic recovery? When you have a situation that very abruptly forces behavioural change on a large scale like this, many of us, in fact, the bulk of us, have been compelled to work from home. The instant sort of concern that comes to mind for me is that what about those who can't? What about, we've spoken about this as well, what about those who we might call the digitally disenfranchised, people who, for financial or other reasons, can't connect digitally? Essentially, they've lost their right to participate in civic society, which goes beyond any questions of economics. That's about your right to be a part of decisions, to be a part of community, and to interact socially. And if you don't have an internet connection, you don't get that. So it's brought to the surface a whole range of inequities that we knew were there. The New Start question, to go back to that, was bleedingly obvious to the extent that the Business Council and groups like that were calling for an increase. Yes. So big tick to government for responding quickly, but did it have to take a global catastrophe to do so? So let's question the rationale on which these decisions are made in future. Let's do something because it's fair, not because it's an emergency response, but simply because it's the fair and compassionate thing to do. If we can hang on to that behaviour and infuse our economic narratives with that kind of ethos, we'll be okay. I think at least it'll be a good start. But that's something to think about. Let's make compassion one of the things that we hang on to.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, thanks so much for that, Andy. And that's correct. I mean, you know, there's been significant, you know, work around the capacity of people on New Start to survive on $40 a day, and a call for for increasing that for some time. And like you say, I mean, it was done pretty quickly and pretty easily, with some clear commitment by all levels of government to address that. And so it does raise questions, doesn't it, about people who experience unemployment due to, perhaps, for example, being older and not being able to enter the workforce, or because there might be some mental health considerations or caring responsibilities. Those people historically, pre-COVID, seemed to be able to live on $40 a day, and there was a community sense that was okay. I'm not sure if it was a community sense, but certainly a public policy response. But now it seems like people who have lost their job, not because of age or whatever their circumstance was, but because of COVID, it's okay now to address that. It's good news, absolutely, but it's interesting, the shift, I think, the shift. So, Natalie, you're working on the ground, grassroots, with young people in Western Sydney. So what are some of the impacts you're seeing and hearing, and how do you think that might be playing out differently in Western Sydney relative to sort of Sydney overall?
It's been a really interesting time, I think, for our young people. We've had a lot of conversations with the young people that we work with and young people that live in Western Sydney, and keeping in mind we generally work with the most at risk or the most disadvantaged. And it's interesting because their perspective on COVID is there's not a lot of fear around what's happening. So in the conversations we're having around, do you have access to the things that you need? We saw the panic buying, that was happening, and people were not getting access to their basic needs, hygiene products, toilet paper. And the response from young people is, well, we've never really had that anyway, so we're used to it. And I guess that's really disheartening when, when we're in a crisis situation and young people don't identify that that's a crisis because they're already living in that level of chaos. And so again, when you start to, when this issue impacts, I guess, people outside of the margins, how is our response different? And exactly what we're talking about with the New Start, that all of a sudden it's okay to increase those rates, whereas prior to that it was a struggle to get there. So for the young people, it's really just magnified the social problems that they experience anyway. Lack of access to, employment or education or even technology, and we've seen this shift in organisations, the knee-jerk reaction, well, let's move everything online, which is great. However, when you don't have access to a computer or the internet, or you don't have credit on your phone, those services, are still really inaccessible for young people. And I think the other really important thing for young people in particular is, one thing that we always talk about is there's not enough spaces for young people and not enough safe spaces. And so again, when, this situation has happened and we've cut access, you can't leave your house, a lot of our young people are not even abiding by those because they don't want to be at home or they don't have a safe place to begin with. And so it's been a really interesting time for young people. I think it's, in a sense, it's exciting in the way that we can now, when people outside of the margins start to feel the same stress and pressures that marginalised people start to feel, we can gain a better sense of empathy and understanding. And hopefully that's what shifts people's mindsets in terms of policy making and decision making.
Yes, absolutely. Some excellent points. And I think that, certainly in my work over the last 4 to 5 weeks, and the community members and agencies that I've been speaking to, that's exactly some of the things I'm hearing. I already live in a COVID world without COVID, and I'm experiencing some of these challenges already. So thank you for sharing that, Natalie. Ben, so from your perspective, what impacts are you seeing and hearing, and how might they be a little bit different or playing out a little bit differently in Western Sydney to the metropolitan?
Yeah, for me, I think the real change that we've seen is how things are being valued. Well, not just things, but people and roles within our communities. So, Nat mentioned the toilet paper thing where, you saw the lady beating each other up at Woolworths in Auburn over a couple of rolls of toilet paper. I think that highlighted the thing that, we need to have a serious look at ourselves about how we value things, but how we value our capacity to be able to have things for everyone. You're seeing, luckily for me, my kids aren't in school anymore, but for those parents who have had to do some homeschooling, I'm sure that, you have seen a revaluing of the role of a teacher. You've seen the revaluing of the roles of childcare. So I think for us, it's hopefully, post-COVID, we're going to see different values put upon, different types of roles in our communities. All of a sudden, we don't have elite football, and yet we're surviving. So we just need to have a rethink about, how we value both those financially, but also in terms of, their place in our community as well. For older people who are mostly our clientele at Great Community Transport, the thing that surprised me was the valuing of safety versus isolation. So with the lockdown, all of a sudden, anyone over 70 was shut in, basically home arrest, really. And if they didn't have some capacity within their family or within their close network to support them in that, then they were becoming more isolated than ever. Older people in their own homes have generally an isolation problem as it is. But I think COVID has really highlighted this enormously. And for us, when we had a conversation with our clients saying, I'm sorry, we can't do that for you right now, their view a lot of the time has become, well, you know what, I'm kind of over this COVID thing. I'd much rather go out and talk to my friends in a social setting than I am worried about, getting COVID and potentially dying. So, it's a real change in the value of connection versus, the valuing of safety.
Yeah, and they're excellent points. And I think that all three of you have really talked about how and demonstrated some of the shifts in or the potential shifts in terms of the values of the community. And what we know historically, it's that grassroots shift in community values and what they see as important in life and in the community and in the world that they live in, that trickles down to changes in government, changes in public policy, and changes in the in our priorities moving forward. So thank you for that introduction, and you've really hit on some of the key considerations that are playing out in Western Sydney and beyond across the nation and the world. So Natalie, I might turn to you to kick off on this particular question, but will business as usual, as it was, will that build and sustain community health and well-being moving forward?
Well, first we need to, I think, look at what was business as usual and be really critical and reflective in understanding what did that look like prior to this. In my opinion, business as usual is not working. I mean, if business as usual was actually working in terms of building and sustaining community wellbeing, particularly in Western Sydney, we wouldn't be seeing the high levels of social disadvantage that we're seeing. So I think it also has demonstrated that, again, during this time, if that was working, now that we've had an increase of more people experiencing this social disadvantage because of COVID, we would have just kept going as usual, but we haven't. And we've seen, that real knee-jerk reaction of and complete 360 to go, okay, we're not doing any of this anymore and we're going to start doing these things is really, really interesting. So in the youth sector as well, and everyone that speaks to me knows that there's one thing I'm really, really passionate about is that it's just not working, and we need to be really honest about that and really critical and think about why is it not working? And we're in 2020, and I often talk about what is the future of young people in 2020 and beyond. We're living in a completely different world, and again, COVID is reinforcing and reiterating that this is the first situation we've had to deal with. It's not going to be the last. And when we look at the youth sector and how we are addressing, I guess, the disadvantaged young people are experiencing, at best, we're using frameworks from early 2000s, which was 20 years ago. And at worst, we're probably still using models from the 1990s. And that's just not good enough. And so business as usual is not working. This is a fantastic opportunity to really look at what did we drop like a hot potato? What are some of those things that people went, oh, we can't do that anymore? And being critical around why can't we do that anymore? Is it not responsive? Is it not working for our communities? And if we want to move forward and we want to talk about how do we change our business as usual, or how do we change, I guess, the status quo, first and foremost, we need our communities at the forefront of that. And we really need them, I guess, to be the ones that are talking about how do services work for them and what wasn't working before, or what's working now, or what should be working in the future. So yeah, business as usual, this is a great opportunity. And, you know, a lot of people when I speak to and I talk about, you know, the vision for young people in Western Sydney, and often the response is, yeah, but Nat, the system's broken. And we know the system's broken. We know this. Everything's at crisis point, you know, our justice system, our education, our child protection system, our health, it's all at crisis point. So if business as usual was working, we would continue. So I think this is a really great opportunity to, yeah, if the system's broken, let's move away from it and let's build something completely new.
Yeah, and that, you know, that whole idea of, you know, being at crisis, and I think certainly in this sort of COVID environment, as a human services industry, what we're seeing is that we're really struggling in the models that we have to support communities in that sort of early end where there's sort of a prevention and early intervention element. We're finding it really hard to sustain the level of service there, and we're seeing more and more people moving into crisis, not only in business as usual, but, you know, that's being exacerbated now. And yeah, this is certainly an opportunity to think about what business in the future might look like. Andy, do you have some thoughts about that? Will business as usual build and sustain community health and wellbeing?
The greatest temptation and impulse, again, you know, through government and industry would be to return to business as usual. They depend on those structures. I think that again, the challenge will be how can we take the learnings of this experience about the things that Natalie and Ben have spoken about, how we've taken a second look at things that we thought we understood. And mostly that second look has been about developing greater empathy and understanding for circumstances of people who need assistance and who need support. But what's glaringly obvious through the last few weeks is that everyone needs a level of support, everyone. And it's been the great democratiser, this pandemic, because the dependencies that people are dealing with are things they thought they never had, simply through having to experience isolation, the things that Ben outlined earlier on. So how do you go back to a system, as Natalie said, that was already broken? The short answer is you don't. You use the sharp shock of the pandemic and the response as a way to almost press the reset button. The most dangerous thing we can do is go back to normal. I think Tim Williams uses the phrase, Tim Williams from ARIP and formerly Committee for Sydney, about not about bouncing back, but bouncing forward. Yeah. So ensuring that we don't go back into the same grooves, the same damaging systems that disenfranchise people. I think that'll be the real challenge. There are certain things that we should always keep doing, the things that we do because they're the right and they're the compassionate thing to do, and the things that we do because the evidence tells us we should do them, right? They're essential ingredients. The rest of it's out the window. Yeah. The economic rationales that were put forward as to why we can't be more compassionate as a society, turns out they weren't real.
Absolutely.
Well, they were.
Absolutely. Yes,
we'll feel them
a choice, weren't they?
Yeah, for a while. But look, it turns out they weren't impossible. So that'll be the real trick. How do we bounce forward? But and we can be guided. It's not entirely unnew. If we hang on to those principles, treat people decently and compassionately, listen to the evidence, the rest of it should look after itself.
Yeah.
Because nothing's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Yeah, I think that this is something that sometimes we forget. We get so caught up in delivery and focusing on getting outputs, and stuff done, that we forget that we make some really key public policy choices that shape what people's lives are like on the ground. And I think that's really key, and we always need to be, in terms of moving forward. It's something key that we really need to revisit. Now, Ben, so what about from your perspective? Business as usual? Is that the answer?
I think we've broken business as usual. I hope we have anyway. At an organisational level, for an organisation like Great Community Transport, I mean, we need to make sure that we reinforce back to our funders and back to our communities that the things that we've learned in this time is that we need to do a better job of connecting with our clients, but connecting the clients together as well. So, I mean, we can sometimes get caught up with, well, we need to put X amount of people on a bus. But that's not, as you say, that's the output. It's not the outcome. And we've had some capacity to reflect on what business as usual, what bits of business as usual we should keep and which we should move on from. And the challenge for the forum and the community of community organisations is that we need to put that our learnings in the last 6 weeks, and by the time we're through with COVID, 12 or 26 weeks, that this is what we've learned, and this is what you need to change now, and make sure that is front and centre for a government response.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, the context of our conversation, and no doubt all our conversations at the moment has been about change and reform. But when we talk about business as usual, what we know is that the last, at least couple of decades, if not more, have been full of change and reform. So it's almost ironic, isn't it, that we're sort of that change and reform hasn't actually landed us in a place where people are better off, where the social indicators are improving. So yeah, some really good points. And I want to turn to some pathways in a moment. But before I do that, two things. Firstly, everybody listening, I'm sure that you've got some amazing thoughts or comments to make as we're having this conversation. So please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll bring you, we'll enable your voice and bring you into the conversation. So before we turn to pathways, I want to go back to that Western Sydney factor. So what we've seen is increasing evidence, continually increasing, and we've known for some time of increasing levels of socio-spatial polarisation. So when I say that, what I mean is that growing gap in income, growing gap in wealth, so essentially a growing inequity, and that it's based on geography. So we're seeing this sort of relationship between inequities and geography, and this is incredibly important for Western Sydney. And we're seeing evidence that in terms of socio-spatial polarisation around, us creating, increasing and perpetuating that gap between essentially the haves and the have-nots. Could this be the time to genuinely address socio-spatial polarisation, Andy?
Yeah, these are the occasions when those gaps become glaringly obvious. I think one of the things that struck me is that they've always been there.
That's right.
The economic factor is the easy one to point to. People look at income levels and employment levels, and as they do, governments become obsessed with economic indicators. The striking ones for me, though, are health outcomes and educational outcomes, because we know that both of those underlie the economic factors, and both of those things have impacts on the generational trajectory of people out of poverty. So Western Sydney has had some pretty significant improvements in some of those areas in recent years, but the work is still really patchy. So when you hear about, large-scale infrastructure investment, yes, that's occurring, but it's occurring, largely to the benefit of industry and largely to the benefit of the people who are already well-resourced. And it's occurring in areas that typically aren't representative of those people in the most profound disadvantage. There were parts of outer southwestern Sydney and outer western Sydney in particular where, we already have youth unemployment in excess of 25%. We already have adult unemployment in excess of 10%. And they're talking about that as though it's going to be a catastrophe for the nation if we hit 10% unemployment. That catastrophe has been a long, slow, painful bleed for people in those locations of Western Sydney now for generations. Why are they any less important than anybody else? Why is it any less of a catastrophe than that which we might see play out federally? They're the questions we have to answer. And when you're doing things like putting together recovery strategies, go to the areas that are hurting the most. Don't have a situation where we have a recovery strategy that plays only into the hands of those that already have momentum. Go to the areas where it's most needed. And we could pull out a map of Western Sydney, and I'm sure all of us on this panel could point to where those areas are. It's bloody obvious. Look at the data and respond.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that, discussions around continuing stimulus, because we know the impact isn't, people aren't just going to be able to get back into work immediately after COVID and, moving forward. We know that following the GFC, so the global financial crisis, the impact in Australia was that it took around 6 years for people to get back into work, and some people never did. And I think that my recollection is that it was sort of males around that sort of middle age that most struggled to get back into work. So absolutely need to be looking at, where is it hurting the most and how to move forward.
I mean, the other element
I
here
think
too.
Some of the stimulus.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, Billie, on the health front too, the morbidity rates that we have with diabetes, heart disease, Indigenous health, mental health in areas of Western Sydney are far and away above the levels of mortality we're seeing through this current pandemic, as tragic as that is. I think it's important to remember that we already have those profound challenges in place in Western Sydney. Let's use the learnings through this experience to address those as well as the economic consequences.
Absolutely. Ben, is this the time to genuinely address those sort of inequities, the socio-spatial polarisation that we're seeing and that has been growing over the last few decades?
Billie, from our perspective in the community transport sector, the gaps are obvious, or the application of the gaps that Andy's mentioned, the education and the wealth differences and so on. Those you see that in a community transport context because the community transports in the inner west, they're cashless. They have well-educated people who have a good system of cashless transactions. Whereas you find that community transport in broader Western Sydney, which great community transport would represent about half of, you're actually seeing that we do 90% of our transactions in cash. This is in my mind a reflection on those gaps that you find in the education system. And that's without even really going into the example of the health gaps.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they are. They're very clear. I mean, not only do we have the evidence, you know, it's just clear when you live in Western Sydney. It's very clear. So, what is the pathway to access and fairness and equity, Natalie? How do we get there?
I think the pathway is communities leading, and that's what we're not seeing. That's what we haven't seen for a really long time. When we look at, you know, planning, when we're talking about that socio-spatial, the polarization, and what we've spoken about today is the most important thing is social capital. So you can have really good infrastructure and you can have really good planning processes and you can, you know, all those things can be really great. But if you don't have social capital, what does that all mean at the end of the day? It doesn't mean much. And so I think if we want to create pathways to, you know, access and equity, first and foremost, communities need to be at the forefront. That's just really simple. You know, government processes and planning processes are really fragmented. Different departments have different agendas, and policymakers make decisions that don't necessarily reflect well on the ground. And so we need to make sure that our policymakers and our practitioners and our communities are all working hand in hand together. And it's not that top-down approach that it's always been. And especially for Western Sydney and really marginalised groups in Western Sydney, like our young people who just get dumped with, well, this is what's happening to you and this is what's happening in your area, and too bad, so sad for you, you know. So I think the pathway really is communities leading first and foremost. And then secondly, I think it's really about responding when communities are saying, this is what we want, this is what we need, this is how it needs to look for us, is that we respond, and that budgets and the decisions around budgeting and the allocation follows through with that, and that it's really embedded on the ground, because we're still seeing this disconnect around what's happening on the ground and what's happening in policy. So it's definitely communities leading.
Yeah, and that, you know, we've talked quite a bit about evidence at the moment, so the evidence is there, and certainly communities leading is about evidence too, isn't it? You know, based on people's experiences. So Andy, how do we, within this sort of within this political environment that we have, in fact, you know, I mean, it's been quite promising. What we've seen is governments across all levels suddenly sort of coming together and being able to work together very effectively and in a bipartisan way to get sort of some pretty thought of outcomes moved forward very quickly. So how do we get that? How do we get that integration between evidence and public policy decision making and investment, and based on community need where it's most needed?
Look, it's a good question. I think the emergency response at the government level has been pretty remarkable. So I give it a big tick with conditions, and then I'll talk about Western Sydney towards the end of that. But I think to a large extent, it was the result of the management of the bushfires crisis being so abysmal. And so governments at all levels were, you know, I guess very, very well prepared and determined not to be caught, you know, wrong-footed when it came to something of the scale of the pandemic. So they responded well, and they responded strongly very early. The travel ban, the bringing together of the national cabinet with state premiers, very, very effective. I think that the only criticism I would suggest there is that, you know, you would include opposition representation on something like that, simply in the spirit of bipartisanship. They haven't done that, but I have to say it's been pretty effective. It's allowed the premiers to have the latitude to make decisions on things as controversial as they are about schools, yes, and other facilities, but generally it's kind of worked, and it's given the community a voice as well. So I notice in a lot of the dictates that come through, there are some hard and fast ones, like, you know, you can't go to the beach and run around with your mates, but you can use your discretion about whether you send your kids to school. You can use your discretion about some behaviours. That's good. There's been a big imposition on civil liberties that's occurred, and when civil liberties are imposed upon, it's always those at the margins that are affected most deeply. As I said at the outset, I'm very concerned about those who can't participate digitally. That's another forum in itself.
Yes.
The question, though, is about how does all of this government response trickle down to the local level, down into Western Sydney? Broadly, councils have across Western Sydney have had I guess, little to do in terms of their response. I know that they've done some very basic things like, they're not chasing debts, or they're not chasing, I guess, outstanding financial impost at the moment. Some agencies have come around and done the same thing as well. That's been pretty good. The trick will be how long we hang on to these things. If the economic lag is as long as they suggest it will be, I've heard anything up to 3 to 5, possibly even 10 years, worst case scenario. What about when the utilities companies and when government agencies lift a lot of those moratoriums on debt? What happens then? And what happens when Centrelink snaps back and becomes again that almost punitive regime? So that the trick will be how we use government's response to bring longevity and a continuum. Because one of the most important things you can give people experiencing marginalisation is certainty. And I think that's what's needed now. And that's where government could take the next step. They've responded well to the crisis, but you don't get a pass mark until you respond to things in that long-term recovery phase, and they need to deliver certainty.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think that, given the not only the uncertainty around our, public health crisis, but, the economic impacts, and obviously economic impacts are social impacts, because economy doesn't exist to serve itself, or it shouldn't exist to serve itself. The economy exists to ensure people and communities are healthy and, their well-being is safeguarded. So, Ben, what collectively can we do as an industry, as a sector, to sort of progress some of these conversations and to progress supporting employment and access to housing and services, and in a way, that is socially, economically, and environmentally healthier?
Billie, would I be too biased in suggesting that we support the forum in much of its data collection and presentation to the advocacy of such ideas? At the risk of being flippant, I think our sector really is the best sector at collaborating. I originally came from the commercial sector, and if you told your opposition what you were going to do next and would they like to be a part of it, you'd be shown the door in pretty quick time. But for me, working in the community sector is one of the great things, because I get to have a conversation with Nat about how we engage young people in engaging older people, and I think as a broader sector, with some of the infrastructure that the forum provides, we need to just keep doing that in such a way where we are able to provide anecdotally and data drivenly, the bullets that the forum can shoot. So, get involved in these forums. Make sure that we provide as much data and the anecdotes that the sector needs to put forward to change minds. And we don't want people at the end of this to be going, well, the business as usual bit worked quite well, let's go back to that. We need to be striving harder right now to say, well, that's no longer good enough, and here's all of the information that the forum has presented to convince people otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, whilst that evidence, as we talk about it, and Natalie, your sort of excellent articulation of bottoms up and community led, so that it does respond to need, even though we have that, and increasingly more so, it sounds to me like it's never been more important to be able to bring that to the fore and really share that as widely as possible, and get conversation going around that, so that we can start to shape those sort of worldviews, those expectations, and those those solutions moving into the future. So Natalie, from your perspective, before I go to you, Natalie, again, encouraging those of you, I know that you're there, so encouraging any comments or questions from the floor. In fact, any ideas around, you know, how we can collectively progress some of those key considerations into the future. And of course, today we're just starting that conversation, and there'll be plenty more conversation going on, not only generally about a more accessible and equitable future for Western Sydney, but also how specific areas like employment, education, transport and so on can be more accessible and equitable, you know, moving into the future. So Natalie, back to you. So how do you think what are some of the key strategies or decisions that are needed specifically to progress, you know, a more socially, economically and environmentally healthier sort of future?
I think we need a real holistic and coordinated approach to it because, you know, I mentioned before, things are quite fragmented at different levels. And I take Ben's point that, yes, there is a lot of collaboration that happens in the sector, but there's also a lot of fragmentation on the ground, as well as in policy making and urban planning, decision making, things like that. So it needs to be really coordinated and holistic. But I think we also really need to be looking at the intersectionality of all these issues that you mentioned before in terms of housing and unemployment and education. They all intersect. And so when we're working in those silos or we're planning just based on the individual issue, we're not addressing it as a whole. And I think the way forward really is we need to put, I think, you know, social inclusion frameworks and practices and values need to underpin every decision, every policy at every level. And so again, looking at Western Sydney and that urban planning and talking about, you know, the infrastructure or the roads, but then what does that mean for those communities, and thinking about how are we creating these communities? So are we building communities for disadvantaged people, or are we building communities that are disadvantaging people? And without a real coordinated approach to that, it's still going to be fragmented. So I think, you know, first we need to look at being a bit more coordinated in how we respond to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is certainly in business as usual. That's also been one of the key considerations and I guess criticisms, you know, some sort of coordinated effort, not just in terms of the sector in Western Sydney, but beyond that, you know, at a sort of metropolitan level, at a state level, and certainly beyond that at a national level. So, you know, I could talk about this this sort of stuff for a long time, but I think that today has been an opportunity for us to start that conversation, as I said, around you know, a more accessible and more equitable future, generally, but specifically for us in terms of Western Sydney and what we might be able to do there. And as I said, we'll certainly continue that conversation. But to finish up, I guess what I'd like to just ask all of you to share is, I mean, some of your thoughts about what are some of the key sort of priorities that we need to start advocating and putting on the table right here and now, and not waiting until, you know, 6 months or a year or 2 years. So Andy, starting with you.
As much as I talked, Billie, about wanting to break apart this obsession with economics politically, I suspect we'll only be able to chip away at it at the edges, which is significant. And the best way for this sector to do that is to make sure that when government are coming up with stimulus proposals, that they're not all about fast rail or built infrastructure or roads or, you know, things of I guess that industrial scale. Let's think about how we get social infrastructure up the list. Let's think about how we support the activities of our members by giving them the facilities and the resources they need. So I'd encourage everyone, get busy and pull together your social infrastructure, economic stimulus packages, right? Saturate government with them. And here's a tip, make them ridiculously big. Because stimulus is called stimulus for a reason. It requires scale. and it requires demonstrable impact. Here's another tip. It's pointers for people doing stimulus packages. Don't ask for money for people. Government hate that, and they'll never pay for it. They pay for programs and equipment. They love to pay for stuff they can come and open and snip a ribbon on. And there'll be stacks of that going on in the recovery phase. So put some big stimulus packages together for social infrastructure, facilities, equipment, and resources, and give them as much scale as you can and get them in, state and federal government. Heck, you can even write to me for some pointers if you like. I think this is where groups like the Forum really come into play, because we can help with those types of activities. But now's the time. Don't wait. Get them together and dream big.
Yeah. Some really, agreed. Think big. That's and I think that at the beginning of the session, that's certainly something that I said. We shouldn't shy away from these sort of bigger picture issues, and be really at the forefront of that. Now, what has happened is we have lots and lots of comments and questions that have come through on the Q&A. So for some reason, they didn't pop up on my screen until now, so my apologies, but we'll go through a few of those. So from Helen O'Loughlin, I think the movement of essential services onto digital platforms while providing convenience provides a very salutary lesson for being very careful about how we design smart cities. Essential services need to be available for all members of our community. How can smart city design use positive aspects of online services, example, on-demand transport, but ensure the way we use the technology doesn't exclude? So thank you for that, Helen. Absolutely a key issue, and builds on what Andy was saying. So Andy, do you have any further thoughts, or Ben or Natalie, in terms of those, tech, access to tech and the smart cities?
I might just go in quickly because I've got to drop off. I turn into a pumpkin at noon, Billie, so I'll have to leave.
Okay.
But yes, the way we design cities matters. I think for the reasons that Ben would understand around transport and the movement of people through those spaces, and Natalie would understand in terms of service access, cities need to be designed with our most vulnerable people in mind. I think that the logic behind cities now is all about those economic imperatives. It's about the movement of capital. Let's make cities about the movement of people.
Yeah.
And that's the philosophy we should embrace. That means we're more sustainable, but it means services are more accessible. And I think cities should have free Wi-Fi. Every city should be marked on the basics of digital connectivity. If people can't afford it, give them Wi-Fi access for free. That's the way to lift them out of disadvantage. Give them access.
Absolutely. So we've also got from Anita Hannah, what can the sector do to affect change for the future? So certainly we've discussed that in quite detail. She says we are currently seeing people access their super, prioritising access to food now over their own future. Children and young people will be paying for our current expenditure for many years down the track. And the PM has said that job seeker payment will stop after COVID-19 subsidies. There is a need for change, but how do we work together to make it happen? And really important questions, and certainly questions that we've started answering today. From Helen O'Loughlin again, many quotes across various nations have a saying that along the lines that say a country community leader is judged by the way they treat their most vulnerable. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Helen. Certainly reinforcing some of the conversation today. From Lucy Brotherton, Lucy says, does the panel think there are some roadblocks such as media, politics and big business? Look, I think that is an excellent question, Lucy, and thank you for asking it. And I'm sorry I didn't see that earlier. And are these roadblocks? Who will push business as usual as it suits their interests? They have ignored evidence and calls from community organisations before. Yes, and that really reinforces, Natalie, some of the comments you've made in relation to, we've known, we've been saying this for some time, and we really need to see some shifts around this. And I think, Lucy, your question around media, politics and big business, maybe we can have some more conversations on a live stream forum about that into the future. Helen O'Loughlin again, what changes would a leader make or a government response cover bearing this and these sentiments in the long term? Again, very good questions. And Ben, you touched on some of those in terms of sector leadership as well as organisational leadership. Anita Hannah, is there a need to engage with politics, political lead? Again, it's that question around the political economy and civic participation, really some key questions. Heather Nesbitt, thank you, Heather, for your comment. Great discussion, everybody. Do you think that the current vision for Western Sydney's growth and development has changed as a result of COVID-19? Now, we are at the end of our session. Now, that is an excellent question, Heather, and I think that that might actually form one of our future panels specifically where we can look at that. What's changed and what needs to be different into the future, given the level of interest and investment in Western Sydney? Are there new opportunities? Accelerating transport, these are all some really key options. Nafier, is the forum, Western Sydney Community Forum, considering forming an alliance or a lobby group of some sort with local services and community members to work towards retaining some of these learnings? Absolutely, and I think that at the end of the session, that's certainly something that everyone sort of thumbs up and said, yes, let's look at how we can move that forward. Helen O'Loughlin says, thank you for this, Billie, because we do know that once vulnerable people who are already in casual jobs with limited skills lose employment in conditions of economic crises, you know, may never work again. Absolutely. So these are some key things that we've touched on today that we need to explore further. Yes, Andy, hooray, Helen says to your comments. And I think at that point, we did have some few more comments coming through. And again, my apologies for...
Billie, we can save them and answer them later on. We'll just
absolutely
have Charlton save them.
Yes,
we'll respond.
Yes. We absolutely can, and we can respond to those offline. Thank you for those. And again, apologies for not being able to respond and discuss all those live. And I just want to, knowing that some of you are going to turn into a pumpkin in exactly 1 minute, I just want to thank you, Andy, Natalie, and Ben for for coming here today for us as the Regional Social Development Council to really just kick off this conversation. And clearly from the comments that have come through, there's plenty of further discussion and specific discussion that needs to be had. So thank you, Andy, Natalie, and Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Billie.
Thanks, Billie.
So it certainly has been an interesting session, and obviously we've just really just started to have this conversation, and I think it's timely. And again, acknowledging that we will respond to those questions and comments separately, and certainly follow up in terms of additional sessions. Finally, I'd just like to remind you that Western Sydney Community Forum has actually established a range of new COVID-related services, including an impact analysis that we've completed and are tracking over time. We have a clearinghouse in place to support service continuity for community services agencies, a Q&A portal with a series of experts who are available to answer rapidly within 48 hours your questions, and we also provide in-house rapid service continuity assistance. So just keep those in mind. And just a reminder, now if you do have any further questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you again for joining us, and stay well, and goodbye for now.